Welcome back to the fifth video in this tutorial series on writing unit and integration tests for your React and Redux web applications. Now in the last video, we took a timeout from building our application and writing tests so that we could implement Redux into our application. Now in this video, we're actually going to be looking at reducers and specifically how to test them. Now this is a tutorial series, so I want to encourage you guys to check out the official playlist for it. You can find that on our channel by searching SimpleTut, or there will be a direct link in the description of this video. At the point of this recording, this is the fifth video of this series. We already have a bunch of other videos on this playlist, but as we go through the series, we will be posting them all here. Something else that you guys should definitely check out is, of course, the official GitHub repository for this project. Again, there'll be a direct link in the description of this video. You can also find it by visiting our page on GitHub, which is github.com/simpletut, and finding the testing React Redux with Jest and Enzyme repository. Again, if you've watched any of the other videos in this series, you will know at the end of each video and each tutorial, we're committing the code, we're pushing it up to this repository. So if at any point you want to look or examine the code that we're writing in your own time, then please check out this repository. Again, I just want to encourage you guys to like, rate, subscribe to us on YouTube, GitHub, and even Facebook, because these are great ways for you to stay in touch with us as we release new content, supporting us and helping us to continue bringing this kind of content. Now, before we start writing any code, let's take a look at the wireframe that we have for the application that we're building. Now, if we just take a look at our actual application, I have this running in the background. You can see we've already done quite a large amount of work, but let's just take a look at some of the components we haven't built yet. So we have this button we need to create, and when a user clicks that button, we want to make an asynchronous request to an external API. We're going to fetch some posts, and then we're going to render them out on a page. Now, if I just open up my Postman, I have a placeholder API, right? So this is an endpoint that we're going to be working with. It just returns an array of objects with a title and body. Those keys are the main ones because we want to render those on our page. Again, this is something that we're probably going to be looking at more in the next video of this series, where we actually look at making that request with an action creator. In this video, we're just looking at the reducers. So let's go ahead and get started. Now I already have my application running in the background. I've also got my watch command running for my tests. So if I make any changes to my existing tests, if I create new tests, they're immediately going to appear here, and they're going to rerun every time I save them. So they're going to tell me if they're all passing or failing, etc. So very, very useful command. We have that running already. So let's come back over to our text editor. Again, I'm working with VS Code. Now in the last video where we actually implemented Redux, I created this success reducer. Now this success reducer doesn't really do anything, it just returns null. Now the reason that we did that was because when you actually implement Redux and you create your store, you have to pass at least one reducer to your store, or you're going to get a bunch of errors. Now because I didn't want to confuse anyone, I just created a boilerplate reducer, just returning null, so not actually really doing anything, to prevent us seeing any errors. And the reason I didn't cover building out a reducer in that video was because I wanted to save that content for now. I wanted to really go through it and devote an entire video just to building out the reducer. So let's go ahead and do that. Now I'm actually going to delete this success reducer because we really don't need it. It was really just serving a purpose in the last video because I wanted to show you guys how to implement Redux, again, without seeing any errors. So let's go ahead and delete that because we're going to actually create the reducer that we actually want to work with our application. Now we're going to be building a posts reducer. So again, we're actually going to be going out and fetching posts. So we want to have a posts reducer. Now, something that you need to understand when it comes to working with reducers is that they are a pure function, right? So the difference between a pure function and an impure function is really just the fact that a pure function returns a new piece of state, right? So it isn't going to mutate or make any changes to anything outside the scope of that function. Another important thing about working with reducers is that you shouldn't have any complex logic within your reducer. All you want to do in a reducer is return a new piece of state, all right? You just take the payload and you return it. That's all you want to do. So let's go ahead and take a look at implementing that. So within my reducers folder, I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to just call this my posts folder. And inside of this, we're going to have reducer.js, and we're going to have a test file. So that's going to be spec.js. Now at this point, I think you guys are pretty confident when it comes to testing with React. So I think we're ready to take it up to the next stage where we start taking a more TDD approach. This is where we start writing our tests first because we want to see our tests fail before they pass. So in this case, I'm actually going to write the tests for my reducer before I actually write the logic that goes into my reducer. This is going to allow me to have more confidence that my tests are passing because my code works. But another advantage of taking a TDD approach, and one of the main reasons that it is so popular, is because we're generally going to get a higher test coverage. So depending on how you write your tests, you're probably going to find that you write more tests taking a TDD approach than you would if you writ your tests after you writ your components and whatever logic it is that we're testing at the time. Now, the one problem that we have when it comes to testing our reducer is that we're testing a function. Okay, so we need some kind of bare bones function that we can actually write a test for. Otherwise, we're really going to have a tough time trying to write some tests. So before we can actually go ahead and write any tests, I'm going to come over to my reducer.js. This is going to be the file that contains my post reducer. I'm just going to write a bare bones function. It doesn't really do anything yet. It's just going to return null. So that's just going to export default. It's going to be a function. It's going to accept two arguments. The first is going to be some state. If there isn't any state passed, the default value will just be an empty array. And the second is going to be some kind of an action. And again, this is a function, so I'm going to use that ES6 syntax, and I'm just going to return null. Okay, so I'm going to be able to come back to this when it comes to actually writing out a reducer. Now this action object is going to contain a type and a payload. Now all a reducer is a switch statement. It's just going to check whether the action's type matches, and if it does, it's going to return some new piece of state, and that's going to be used to update the store. Now if that doesn't match, it's going to simply return the default piece of state, which in this case is an array. Now the way that Redux actually works is whenever we dispatch an action, every single reducer in our store gets that and receives that action, which is why we have the default piece of state that we're going to return in the event that we don't get a match. Now the one problem that we have at this point is that we don't actually have any types defined. And that's because we haven't actually gotten to writing any of our action creators. That's going to be in the next tutorial of this series. So although we don't want to worry about the actual action creators, our types are generally stored separately. So let's go ahead and actually create that because we do actually need to work with that within our tests and our reducer as well. So within my source folder, I'm going to create a new folder. It's going to be called actions. And inside of actions, I'm going to have a types.js file. And I'm also going to, now within my types file, I'm going to export an object. Export const types. It's going to equal an object. And it's simply going to be, and we're going to call this get posts. It's going to equal a string for get posts. Let's save that and come back over to our reducer. And at the top of the file, let's import that constant. So I'm going to import it from actions types, and we want to import types. Now we're going to come back to this, but I also want to import this same constant in my test file. Great. So we're now ready to start writing our first tests. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create my describe. So here's my describe. Now what are we testing? We're testing our posts reducer. We're then going to pass a function, and we're ready to write our first test. Now testing our reducer is going to be fairly straightforward. Now there's only two scenarios that we need to test for. The first scenario is that it returns some kind of default state. Now that's fairly straightforward. The way that works is that, of course, if we don't receive any state, then we're just working with an empty array. And of course, if the action's type doesn't match, we were just going to return that default state that was initially passed. So in this case, that will be an empty array. So let's come back over to our test file and let's write a test for that. So to do that, we're going to write it, and of course we need to describe the test that we're writing. So should return default state, and then all we need to do is parse our function, and then we can create a constant. We're going to call this new state equals, and of course now we need to import the reducer itself, because as I've mentioned previously, we're actually working with a function. That's really what we're testing. So let's go ahead and import that reducer. So I'm going to call this my posts reducer, importing that from reducer. It's in the same directory. And then of course we can just call this reducer as a function, because it's a pure function. It just returns some new piece of state. So let's go back into our reducer. There are two arguments that we need to pass. Now the first thing is state. Now as I've already mentioned, if there is no state passed, we are setting this as an initial value to an empty array. So I can actually, as a first argument, I can just pass undefined. Now the second argument is actually an object. It's expecting an action with various different types and a payload. So the first thing that we need to do in our test is actually just pass an empty object, because we're testing that the type does not match and it should return some default piece of state. So we can just pass an empty object in our test. So then we need to kind of make some kind of assertion. We need to expect for something. So let's expect our new state to equal an empty array. So let's save that and come back over to our terminal. And as you can see, our tests are failing. We expected an empty array and we received null. And the reason we received null is our reducer is just a bare bones function at the moment that returns null. So that's great. Our tests are failing. We want them to be failing right now. I would be worried if they were passing. Now, the second scenario that we need to test for is that our reducer returns a new piece of state if it receives the correct type. So to test that, let's go ahead and write our new test. So here I'm going to say that it should return new state if receiving type. Okay, so let's go ahead, create our function. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to create some kind of constant. I want to create a post array. This is what we're going to be passing and what we should expect to see back. So this is effectively going to be an array of objects. I'm just going to have a title with a string, let's say test1, and I'm going to copy this object so that I can use it here, paste it 3 times, 1, 2, and 3. Great. So we're now ready to write very similar code than what we wrote for our previous test. So we're going to say const new state, and again we're going to be calling our posts reducer, and again we can still pass undefined because it really doesn't matter what initial state we have. And then we want to pass an object, but this time we want to actually match the type. So the type that it is expecting, we're going to get from our types object that we've imported up here. And as you can see, that is going to be get posts, and the payload is going to be our posts here. So the payload will equal posts, which is our array of objects that are up here. So now we can make another assertion. So we can expect that new state to equal posts, and we can save it. That's amazing. Okay, so let's come back over to our terminal, and we should now see that 2 of our tests are failing, as you can see. So in this example, we expected this array, and we received null. So this is really the TDD approach. We've written tests. They're both failing. Now we want to go back and actually write the code for our reducer. Now that's going to be fairly straightforward, and when we write this code, it should make our test pass. Now, as I've already mentioned previously in this video, all a reducer really is a switch statement. So I'm going to delete return null, and I'm going to replace it with a switch statement. It's going to accept our action.type, and we're going to have a case here for our types, the type that we created, which is types.getPosts. And if that is true, then we are going to return the action.payload, and we're going to have this default case where we just return the initial state that we have passed here. So in this case, in the test, for example, if you remember, we were returning, we were checking if the action doesn't match, that we get an empty array. And as you can see, we are going to return that by default if the action doesn't match. Otherwise, we are going to return the payload that is received in the action object. So let's come back over to our test, and let's specifically come over to our terminal, and you can see that our tests are now passing. So congratulations, not only for successfully creating and testing our reducer, but for also, this is the first test that we've written using the TDD approach, where we've written our tests first, we've seen them fail, and then we've written the logic, and we are now seeing our tests passing successfully. Now, something that you may have noticed, but although my tests are passing successfully, if I actually come over to my browser, if you remember, I have my application running in the browser, then our application is actually erroring, right? And it's because earlier in the video, I told you guys we didn't want the success reducer that we created in the previous tutorial. So in our reducers folder, I deleted the reducer file, but we're still actually working with it and passing it to our combined reducers. So now that we've created our reducer, our tests are passing, we're ready to update our combined reducers function. So let's come over and let's delete this success reducer and import our posts reducer. So I'm going to import this as posts. So posts from, and again, posts / reducer. And I'm going to replace success with posts. I'm going to save it. Let's come back over to our browser. You'll see that our application is now running again. And also, if I come over to my terminal, I'm no longer seeing any kind of errors. Okay, so we've successfully written our post reducer. We've also written the tests for it. So let's do a git check-in of our code. So let's do git status. And you can see these are all the files that I've changed or created or deleted. I'm going to do git add all. Let's come back and do a git status. Okay, so let's commit that. So git commit with a message, and I'm going to say that this is our posts reducer with tests. Do another git status, and you can see that I've been working and committed to this development branch, which was called post reducers with tests. So I'm going to do git push origin, and I'm going to push up to that remote branch. And following this video, of course, I'm going to create a pull request. I'm going to merge this with master. So of course, you can check out our GitHub repository, and you can find the code on the master branch up to date with all of our latest tutorials. And that brings us to the end of this video tutorial on working and testing React Redux reducers. In the next video, we're going to be looking at action creators and actually continue building our app. Now, of course, I just want to encourage you guys to check out the official playlist for this series if you haven't already. Again, there'll be a direct link in the description of this video. You can also search our channel, which is SimpleTut. Of course, there'll also be a link in the description to the official GitHub repository. As you just saw at the end of each video, we commit, we push our code. I'm going to merge the development branch you just saw me push to, so our master branch is always going to be up to date with these tutorials and this series. Of course, you can check out this code, go through it in your own time, examine it in a finer detail yourself if you want to. I'd also like to encourage you to visit us on Facebook, facebook.com/. This is a great way for you to stay in touch with us as we release new content. We post here regularly, so you'll get updates from us as we go through the series and release new content. I also want to encourage you guys to like our videos, comment, subscribe, like us on Facebook. And of course, if you do use GitHub, then please do star this repository. But of course, once again, thank you very much for watching this video. And of course, I look forward to seeing you again in the next one.